Welcome back. We're going to be going a little bit deeper now into NGSS versus the scientific method. So if you've ever wondered where the scientific method came from, it was from 1945 in a study published in Science Education by a man named Orion Kieslar. The idea of his study, the elements of the scientific method, was basically to create some understanding of what those main components or elements of the scientific method were. In his study, he said, in this way, a sequence of 12 major steps in the scientific method was evolved, organized in the order in which these might logically be expected to occur in the solution of any scientific problem of such a nature as to involve all 12 steps. As you can imagine, this was a long time ago, but these 12 steps got distilled further into fewer steps. They got published in many textbooks. They were made into many posters that you still see on the walls of many classrooms, and science has often been taught, and this is my experience too, as a set of linear sequenced steps. Scientific method is often the one thing that teachers don't question at all. They consider it the way that science is and is taught. So back to my first year classroom, I didn't have 12 steps, but in my middle school classroom I had something similar to what you can see at the left. Hopefully you've had enough chances to explore so far in this module and in this session to see that there are some differences between the way that we often teach the scientific method, or we're taught to teach the scientific method, and the way that real science is carried out. You probably noticed there's not a linear sequence in real science discovery. You might have noticed that there's a huge amount of community feedback between experts, between those in the field, back and forth and back and forth. Often when we use the scientific method, there is group work, but usually there's a grade from the teacher or a limited amount of feedback that happens that doesn't mirror a real scientific process. Often, whatever you hypothesized is not correct, but instead of stopping when you share your results, that bounces back to the questions and continues in that pinball machine where you test ideas, explore and discover, get your community analysis and feedback, and then look at the benefits and outcomes of what has happened. So this is a pretty big, pretty different process from often what our worksheets, our posters, and the way that we have taught science looks like. So thinking back to my first classroom decorations, my intention as a science educator was not to discourage any practices. I really thought that by teaching this sequence of steps that I was teaching students what the right type of science skills looked like in the proper order. I wasn't aware at that time that I could have actually been discouraging certain mindsets and practices that are conducive to science, especially the way that it's practiced in the real world. You may have noticed if you work with young learners that they come very naturally curious. They ask a lot of questions. They want to test things and try things and learn through play. They start to make claims, and they don't often do it in a sequence that is similar to the scientific method. It often does look more like the pinball machine of real scientific inquiry. So sometimes when we teach this rigid way of doing things, it can actually discourage a lot of what is natural about human sense-making practices. And as your learners begin to get older and they start to be exposed to the way that people begin to reason and make claims and gather evidence around the world, throughout history and now, sometimes we start to believe that it can't possibly be scientific, or they can't be engaging in scientific practices if it doesn't look like this sequence. And to some degree, sometimes if it doesn't happen in a lab, if it doesn't involve sophisticated tech tools. And this is kind of where students develop that idea that maybe science only looks like science if it's a person in a lab coat, pouring substances together. So we really want to broaden their understanding of the scientific endeavor for humans to not just be the person in the lab coat, but to really be something more flexible and more realistic. So fast forward some number of years, NGSS came out, but there was almost nothing on the internet to begin with to help educators develop their units. We're very lucky now that there are so many great resources, almost so many things that say that they're NGSS aligned that it's confusing. But anyhow, we'll get to that in Module 3. What I did instead of creating that linear sequence on my wall with classroom posters was I started to seek out other things. So it actually could be the same posters, but really starting to be flexible with the sequence in which they're carried out so that inquiry can happen. At NGSS Partnership, we're huge fans of the Wonder of Science, all credit to Paul and Laura Anderson, Bozeman Science. We love the scientific inquiry cards, which I'll show you in a graphic in just a moment. And I really love these practices cards. You can find them here in PDF and down here as well. So if you click on these, you're able to print these. You can laminate them. You can have your students handle them. You can put them on your walls, but you can do a lot with those 8 practices in a way that's not always linear, and that may also provide some opportunities for student agency in connection with the NGSS performance expectations. So this is a cycle of inquiry as presented by Wonder of Science, and what you can see at the heart of that process is not settled science in which we're conducting a scientific method-based lab in order to validate existing settled science. What we're doing is looking at something that is observable in order to provoke us to figure something out and to solve something. So that phenomena is something that maybe in the beginning of our unit or in the beginning of our lesson will make us ask questions and try to articulate what we're wondering. We'll also start to construct explanations, and this doesn't have to look the same way for everyone. This could look like developing and using models. It could also involve mathematical and computational thinking. In this phase of planning and carrying out investigations, this is what may have looked like the scientific method steps in the past, but hopefully you'll give your students a chance to figure out what they need to know in order to see if their explanation is correct, and then they can design some of the procedures that will help them investigate, collect evidence, and then move into argumentation. And argumentation can also look a couple different ways depending on if we are creating our own investigations in the classroom that are hands-on, if we're creating simulations, or if we're collecting and obtaining evidence that will help guide us to a conclusion. So why does it matter how students view the scientific process? The NGSS framework in Appendix H states that one fundamental goal of K-12 science education is a scientifically literate person who can understand the nature of scientific knowledge. The generation that we live in now has been described as post-truth, a time in which opinions matter as much as facts. So part of why this is becoming so crucial is that even if all of your students don't go off to become scientists, they need to be scientifically literate people in order to take information in and understand that scientific reasoning does come from observations, patterns, and the collection of evidence over time, hopefully things that have been tested in a variety of ways. So to understand what this switch looks like, we're going to zoom in to planning and carrying out investigations. As we look at this, keep in mind that the right is going to show not only more NGSS-like practices in your classroom, but also practices that mirror real science to a greater degree and that also allow for more student agency in the process of sense-making. So if we're moving away from the scientific method, here are some shifts that you might see. In the scientific method, students might follow a list of steps in order to confirm something that they have already learned about. In real science, students plan and design an investigation to answer one of their own questions, or I should say in mirroring real science. In the scientific method, all students in your class might do the same investigation alone or working in groups. In NGSS, to mirror real science, students will carry out many different investigations. They may have different variables, different materials, and different questions. This part can be stressful for teachers. So the idea is not that you have to provide unlimited options when you begin to create an environment of inquiry, but that you can look at what you have available and just start to increase the amount of options that they have in carrying out their investigations. Finally, In scientific methods, students often share out their data at the end just to confirm that everyone did the lab correctly, and often that's how they get their grade. In NGSS and in mirroring real science, usually there is a great degree of failure, a great degree of things that go wrong, and a lot of feedback process in there. So in NGSS, students engage in an argument from evidence that they've collected in an attempt to collectively understand the phenomena. And often being right is just as valuable as being wrong, or showing that your hypothesis or your original models or explanation was incorrect. A lot of what's been presented today may feel really close to home for the way that you teach science, and I may have just described things that sound like we want you to relinquish a little bit of control. When you're doing inquiry, there are ways to do it with structure, but often in order to truly be constructivist and allow that sense-making process to happen in a way that is more like real science, you do have to give up a little bit of control. Real scientists do not get to call themselves that by repeating labs from settled science that has been done in the past. They're expected to contribute novel ideas and show their skills in novel settings in order to be scientists. And we want our students to have a chance at practicing that. Even if they don't go on to become scientists, we also want them to be scientifically literate people. And understanding through discovery, through feedback, and through considering benefits and outcomes of their tests, we can also get them to understand what the basis for scientific knowledge and literacy is, no matter what they do in their future careers.